Hello, everybody. Welcome back. You are here with the Beer Ladies podcast, and we are on episode 30, if you can believe it. I mean, I don't think that a year ago or so we thought we'd even get this far, but it's absolutely incredible. And we're at episode 30. Today, we're going to be talking about one of those beer styles that has become synonymous with beer, synonymous with craft beer, and that is IPAs. So we're going to go through a little bit about the different kinds of IPAs, do a little bit of myth busting. We're going to tell you kind of what to expect from the flavor profiles. We're going to talk about our favorites, and we're going to see what craft beer, how craft beer's benefited from the addition of the India Pale Ale. Righto. So before we get into what you're drinking, how about I just remind you all, please, to go and like us, follow us, subscribe, do all of those things on all the various social medias. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Where else are we? We're everywhere. Just go find us. We're Beer Ladies Podcast or Beer Ladies Pod on Twitter because there weren't enough characters. We are also on YouTube. So if you'd like to watch along and see which beers we're drinking with your eyes instead of your ears, hop on over there. We're so close to our 100 subscribers, which gives us a little vanity URL, and we're dying for that. So please let it be you. Go and subscribe, even if you only listen to the podcast. Do us a great favor and go and subscribe over on YouTube. That would help us tremendously. All right, guys, we are here today with my excellent friends, Lisa and Christina, and we're going to talk IPAs. So, Lisa, let's go to you first. What are you drinking?
So, Thandi, I am drinking Remember When West Coast IPA from Stone Barrel. So keeping it local, but also going what feels old school West Coast. And for those who are just listening, I'll describe it to you. It's this lovely, deep golden color, very clear, very clear. Important. We're going to get into a lot of that, but definitely, nice and bitter. Really good sort of citrusy hops. Just citrusy, piney hops. Definitely has that sort of I'll say 1990s, early 2000s feel to it. So very happy with it so far.
Lovely, Christina. What have you got?
Okay, so Metalman actually very kindly sent me a box with some lovely merch, which I'm obsessed with because they've just launched their new this new what's the name? Sort of line. That's the word. A new line.
Is it a new line of beer or is it new branding overall?
It's a new line of beer. I think.
Awesome.
My understanding. And I'm loving it because it's
beautiful new branding.
Mid-century futuristic, which I'm so here for because my house is mid-century modern, so I love this. Adore it. So they sent me a box of beer and some of this. And so one of the beers they sent me, which I think is the first of the line, which is the Giant Molecular Clouds, which is a New England IPA. Which I love. So very fruity, lots of tropical notes. Definitely does what it says on the tin. Really enjoying it.
That is awesome. Okay, great. So we've got one West Coast and we've got one East Coast, effectively. I'm going to tip the hat. Either which way I'm tipping it. We're going West Coast today. I've got a Scraggy Bay from Kinnegar. And it's their flagship, which is funny because it's also got a ship on it, but it's their flagship IPA, and it's a killer. It's just always a good beer. It's one of those that when you're in the mood for an IPA, you kind of reach for one of these, and I love it. I think it's great. So now that we've got two on the side of West Coast and one on the side of East Coast, I thought what I might do is to just introduce the different kinds of IPAs that we've got, and what even is an IPA anyway. For those who don't know, there's always people learning about different beers, so why not? An IPA is a India Pale Ale. We're going to get to why it was named that a little later on, but it's an India Pale Ale, and it is known for its bitterness. So bitterness comes from hops. Hops have different flavors. So it can be bitter in an earthy way. It can be bitter in a fruity way. It can be bitter in a number of different ways, but it is quite a bitter beer. And it is one of those where the hops are fairly prominent. It's not just the bitterness that they're prominent in. It's also the flavor and the aroma. So the difference between something like a pale ale and an India Pale Ale is more bitterness, more hop aroma, more kind of in your face. Now, I mean, that's probably the most basic thing in the world, right? It's really funny because IPAs aren't always that pale, but they're paler than porters, which is apparently how they became pales. All right, so there are different kinds of IPAs, and they can almost be mapped on a matrix if you want to onto a scale if you really wanted. But bang on, kind of in the middle, is your English IPA, which is supposed to be the beginning or the start of IPAs, and they're known for higher bitterness than other English styles of beer, but with different kinds of hops as well. So those more earthy floral hops, those are very sort of English. Now, on the very kind of other end of the extreme are the sort of American IPAs, which are much more bitter, much more pronounced, much more hoppy. And hoppy and bitter are not the same things. So hoppy is when you can taste or smell the characteristics of the hops besides bitterness. Bitterness can be hidden, even as much as you add, it can be hidden without giving you a hoppy flavor. So anyway, there are different kinds of IPAs. So some of the ones that I think we all know about are East Coast and West Coast. So West Coast IPAs, like Lisa and I, we're both drinking that, are more known for their bitterness. They're more known for their bitterness, whereas East Coast IPAs are more known for their hoppiness. And the difference is in the brewing. So in the brewing, there are different times of the boil that you can add hops, and they'll lend different characteristics to the beer. In a West Coast IPA, you're adding quite a lot of hops at the beginning of the boil. So that means that the beer has got a long time to sit with those hops and be exposed to the bitterness and get all of those juices and all of those oils out to make it really, really bitter. East Coast IPAs, or New England IPAs, as they're sometimes called as well, are much more late hopped or dry hopped. So they don't have a lot of bittering hops. They've got more aroma hops, and they come bucket loads at the end of the boil. So they don't have a lot of bitterness, but they do have a lot of hoppiness. There are some other differences between them, such as like East Coast IPAs often have wheat or oats added to them for like a smoother, creamier mouthfeel, whereas West Coast IPAs, you're almost going for clarity. And that was the fashion before East Coast came in, right? Exactly. Now there are other kinds of IPAs which I think are worth mentioning. So one is a Rye Ipa. So it's just an IPA that's got some of the grain bill replaced with rye, which I love personally. Rye IPAs are one of my favorites. But to be fair, like anything with rye. We've got double and triple IPAs. So that just means, an IPA is normally between 6 and 8% alcohol. When you're in double IPA territory, you're adding more ingredients, more malts, more hops, more everything, and it just results in a higher ABV beer. So normally between 8, 9, 10%. That's what you're looking at. And then you get triple IPAs, which, just throw everything in there. Why not? And
I've got a good quote about those in a bit. We'll get to that.
and those you're looking at, 11, 12, 13% sometimes for one beer, which is, absolutely crazy, although the Belgians do it well. Speaking of Belgians, you do get Belgian IPAs. Now, there is a little bit of talk as to whether it's Belgian yeast with IPA ingredients, which I think is kind of common, or whether you'd almost use some of the Belgian ingredients, but hop it like an IPA. So I think it could be either. It could be interpreted either way, and that's okay. Red IPAs are any IPA that's had some of the grain bill replaced with like a Red X or something that gives it a redness, which often lends a little bit more of a caramel or a toffee sort of sweetness to it. And then one of the best ones, guys, let's build up. It's a black IPA. Yes, don't we love a black IPA?
Stands for black IPA. I don't care if people call it that. I have no issue with it.
No, so it's also
I understand why people do.
So Cascadian dark ales or black IPAs originated from the Northwest, didn't they? The Pacific Northwest. That's maybe. All right, we'll get there. But those are now IPAs that have got roasted malts in it to give it that black, almost like, it looks like a stout, tastes like an IPA. Best thing ever. But it's one of those balancing acts. You can't just add darkness to an IPA that simply. Then we've got now, they don't change the flavor of the IPA that much, but it changes the alcohol. So we've got session IPAs, which are 5% or lower, normally in your 4.5% range, which are good for your easy everyday drinking, have more than one, those kinds of days, and even micro IPAs. So now we're talking less than 3%. I suppose that could be any beer, but it's been done with IPAs, so that's why we know them. Right, that's the IPAs that I can think of, and there's so many. Like, I think you could find your favorite within an IPA range, even if you don't like bitter beers, which is one of the biggest, I guess, crimes in air quotes against IPAs. A lot of people don't like that bitterness, but there are IPAs that are not bitter. So that for me was a really interesting thing. You can look for hoppiness without bitterness, or you can look for bitterness without necessarily getting the hoppiness.
Mm-hmm.
On that, I'm going to tell you all and ask Lisa and Christina to start bringing out their myth-busting chops here, because I heard a rumor, and I'm sure everyone has, right? Everyone knows the story. Well, that IPAs originated from England, and the reason that they were called India Pale Ales was because people added more hops in the barrels as they were traveling to India, colonists and all of that. And it was said that IPAs came from adding more hops, which gave the beers a longer shelf life, so it preserved the beers, and that's why it was called an India Pale Ale. So, you guys, tell me where I'm wrong, or am I?
It's so hard because it's lies, but it's also not. It's one of those things where there are parts of that are true, probably, and then Christina, there are parts of it that are just lies, but it's hard to disambiguate.
Yeah, it's one of those things where there's a little bit of truth to some of the things, and people have made connections between those things that don't exist. So parts of it we have evidence for, and because we have evidence for those pieces, people have gone, okay, well, because we know this, then this must be true, but that part isn't. So we can kind of sort of break it down into what things that we do know, and what things have then taken this sort of folkloric, mythical turn.
Exactly, and some of this we can blame on the British Guild of Beer Writers, because they had a conference in 1994 where they were like, IPA, what is it? And not many people were making them at that point. Not many people were drinking them at that point. Although, I can certainly think back and remember a couple here and there, but just not the ubiquity, certainly. And they were definitely seen as a kind of, historical artifact, a bit strange. But, and again, there were people doing some good research in that area, and we'll get to a little bit more of that. But a lot of it was really kickstarted by this sort of, well, we have this received wisdom that this is what happened, but there's not a lot of evidence for that. A lot of the sort of, story about, we made the IPA super hoppy so it would survive the trip really comes from, we made the Madeira really strong to survive the trip to India. And there's a lot there, I think, to unpack that. Pete Brown does a great job in his Hops and Glory book, so a lot of fun. And I went to his book club the other week online, and he made the great point that, well, first of all, he showed some really fun behind-the-scenes pictures from this book, which I highly recommend, a lot of fun. But he's pointed out that nowadays you can essentially append IPA to the end of anything, and it becomes a beer style that people, air quotes, recognize. But that historic piece gets lost if it even really existed in the first place. But again, there is this bit, again, this nugget of truth that, beers were getting shipped out to India and certainly other, we'll say, warm places in the British colonies. But porter was still much, much, much more, what was being sent out. And no one talks about that. And I think that's really, really interesting. I think we'll circle back to that a little bit more. But it's fascinating to me that we sort of make these assumptions because Madeira was shipped out so that it would age on the way, effectively. We can't really
Madeira
say
wine.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So we can't really say exactly the same thing about the beer, but I think there is this thing that we've kind of lost in that 18th, early 19th century beer. You either have your fresh beer, your mild, or your beer that you would age for a while, and we've sort of lost that sort of understanding, I think. So how much of that though was meant to be fresh versus not? I think we don't have a really good idea. We don't know, to what extent there was, sort of what we'll call like local in air quotes, IPA or certainly pale ale that was being drunk fresh versus sort of aging for 6 months, 12 months, whatever. And there's a lot there that we only have, records from some breweries and not others too. We don't know who was doing what. So I think, Christina, you made some really good points about the bits we do have suggest some things, but they're not definitive.
Yeah, and I so Martin Cornell, I think, is an absolute expert on this, and he's really sort of pulled these myths that are surrounding IPA apart in just an absolutely wonderful way. And so if you go on his blog, which we'll link in the show notes, he has just done extensive research on this. And we can kind of go over some of the things that he has found and what that could tell us and what it doesn't tell us, because a lot of it doesn't tell us things. It offers suggestions, possibilities, things that we might say, well, maybe, but it doesn't really give us necessarily finite, clear answers on all of the things discussed. So with that being said, some of the things that Martin Cornell has found is that that there's evidence of pale ale brewed under that name by 1705, and that it was sold in London by 1709. So with export of beer and ale to India as early as 1711. And so now this is the thing that I'm going to say next, which is what people kind of take and then run with.
Yeah.
This is where things start getting confusing. So he says, based on Martin Cornell's research, that by the 1760s, brewers were advised to add extra hops to beer if it was being sent to warmer climates. But there's no evidence linking this advice to hop export beer to any specific brewery or anything like that. That said, when we see this, if they're being advised to add extra hops to beer if it was being exported to warmer climates, that doesn't necessarily say that they were doing it. It doesn't necessarily say that everyone listened to it. It doesn't say, you have to be careful with this information. And when we're saying extra hops, well, what was the hop rate of the beer that they were initially having? Is it this IPA level hops that we have now, or is it maybe just like what we would determine a pale ale? There's lots of different layers to this. And that being said, no one's calling it an IPA at this time.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we and again, Martin has done amazing work, and he has traced the earliest reference to India Pale Ale. Not from any British publication, not from anything in India, but Australia, Sydney, Australia, in August of 1829. So still very much in the colonial sphere, certainly. But and it's written in such a way that suggests that this was not an unknown term to people, certainly. So it probably does exist somewhere else out there. It would have at least been, something people could speak about and know about. But it's interesting that that's the first so far we've found. And before, I think the earliest one he found before that was from Liverpool in the 1830s. So he's managed to get it back a little further. And again, like any good researcher, he's like, this is the earliest we have found so far. It's not suggesting this is definitive. But it's really, really interesting that it does come in kind of a colonial setting, if you like, but it's again, it was a British beer. It wasn't something being made in Australia and then sent further on to India. It was, talking about a UK brewery that would send their India Pale Ale. And I think you have to think too, like, what does that mean and to whom? Because we know that, again, the vast majority of what was getting sent to India and other colonies was porter. The IPA or the Pale Ale was for the poshos who were the officer class. So is this something that, sort of resonated with a specific audience or, with a specific purchaser? I think that's something too we kind of need to unpack. There's these sort of class elements, all these other things that we kind of know bits and pieces of, but was that different at home versus abroad? I mean, there's a lot there. And certainly if you think about, through the Irish lens where you are sending your West Indies export porter, do you think of that as being a super hoppy beer? Like it's a good question. And are you being told to add more hops to things going to warm climates because you're not doing it? Like what's driving that as a recommendation? Again, there's so many different sort of nuances that it's hard to just say this is the definitive story.
Well, and I also think like we're talking about, like 100-year span or 150, 200-year span where we're kind of talking about these things. So we have to be really careful when we're comparing 1705 to 1822. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened in that time.
Absolutely.
Period. And we're not getting context with this. We're not getting sort of the a lot of this, these other elements. And so, we have to be careful when we're making these sort of comparisons. But, Martin has really found that there's that there's evidence of more hops being added to pale ale if it's being sent to warmer climates.
What did warmer climates have to do with adding more hops? Like what was the reason?
I mean, I think that, the assumption is, and again, it's always an assumption, is that it would last longer, it wouldn't go off. But, you compare to, certainly a Pacific Northwest IPA, and we'll get to that a little later, but when you have that sort of fresh hop character, that wouldn't have been there. They would never have tasted like a beer. And certainly the yields you would have gotten would have been very, very different in terms of just flavor profiles, things like that. And they are different hops. They specifically, later on in this period, like more toward the sort of 1850s, 1860s, were like, ooh, American hops, ew, gross. They didn't like it because they were, too flavorful. In air quotes, that's not the full story. But it's again, it's an interesting thing where we see little bits and pieces, but we don't have the full story, and it makes it really hard to unpack what's happening when and what it means. So.
And there's also possibilities that something was originally suggested because they were trying to solve a problem, and then people just freaking liked it, and so they just kept doing it because they just liked it more. Or a little column A, a little column B. There's a lot of stuff. Like there's all different reasons for this, and they might not all be the same, and it might not be the same reason that it started out, right? So
absolutely.
It might not. So the the advice that we see in the 1760s might not be the same reason why, like, Martin Cornell found a reference like in 1843 that the pale ale prepared for the Indian market was described as carefully fermented, so as to be devoid of all sweetness, or in other words, to be dry, and it contains double the usual quantity of hops. And that's a quote. That's 90 years. Years. There might be a big difference between that. I mean, Lisa mentioned earlier, how IPAs have like slowly crept in to be kind of one of the most popular styles they are now. And that's in 30 years. So
exactly.
there can be a huge change or reasons behind this reason, why this is being imported in 80 years. I mean, that can change a lot.
It occurs to me, though, that, the beers that we talk about today as being IPAs, or, bitter, hoppy, whatever the case is, it really wouldn't have tasted that way in those days.
No.
These would have been beers going on long journeys, so the beers would have been potentially a lot sweeter because, as time goes on, your beer actually gets sweeter. Like you almost would add more hops to keep the balance because it's going to sweeten rather than to make it hoppy or bitter, if that makes sense. And unless it was really well preserved, it might have a little bit of like staleness or oxidization. So it might be slightly papery, and it might be well balanced as opposed to super hoppy, which is what we've interpreted them to be today. Hoppy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's the idea. Oh, yes, go on. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, the levels of sanitation that we have now is just not, they don't have anything like that. So we're talking about a completely different flavor profile. Possible infections, all sorts of things getting into these beers, especially on long journeys. So it's a completely different animal than what we're talking about beer now.
Exactly. That's exactly where I was going to go, was with the idea of sort of infection and different yeasts. There's a sort of back and forth. I feel like there was a sort of back and forth maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Oh, did they use Brettanomyces, whether accidentally or on purpose? And for a while it was, oh no, they wouldn't have done that. And now I feel like it's come back to, well, how could they have avoided it? It just would have been around. And the fact that, again, Brettanomyces, it is the British, if that's kind of where that association comes from, is it because that was just there in those beers, especially these that are, whether or not they're still fermenting after that long, they're probably not. But again, you have to think they were probably kind of sour, and in a way that might be fancy now, not necessarily to my taste, but other. It's an interesting thing that was that, again, what that sort of officer class was into, and was it because it was on purpose or not? We don't know. So,
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, like a Brett IPA was one of those styles that I didn't mention earlier, but a Brett IPA would be a soured IPA, you know, an
And
IPA
they're
that
out
was soured
there,
with,
yeah.
with Brett. At the same time, there was that interesting style that was fashionable a little while ago, but now has seemed to go out of style again. And that was the brut IPAs. You remember
Which
those?
I enjoyed very much for that hot
Very
second they
dry.
were around. Yeah.
Oh, and I should just say before we get too far ahead, if you're interested in learning more about IPAs and IPA styles, I really recommend getting the BJCP Style Guide app. And Thandi talked a lot about the specialty IPAs, and this goes into like the Belgian IPA and different sort of specialty IPAs, just to kind of give you a little bit more information. So, and yeah, it's handy. It's on your phone. Love it.
Exactly. And think about how much they've expanded that. I think like when I first did the BJCP exam, 15 odd years ago, you had American IPA and IPA. And now you've got all these others. And even just to look at the beers that have won either sort of GABF or GBBF medals in IPA, they are wildly different things from either what you would get now or just kind of maybe what you would think of in that category. I was looking up sort of ones that won in kind of the early 1990s, and I was looking at the GABF, and they tended to be like Anchor Liberty Ale, things that I would think of as like a fairly low key pale ale these days, just not that level of bitterness, certainly not that level of hoppiness. So it's really interesting how much that's evolved. And again, Christina, to your point, we're talking about a really short period of time, whereas compared to sort of 150 odd years of a supply chain, effectively, think of everything that changed. It's crazy.
Yeah, and it's like IPA, I feel like for a point in time here has just been like a battle of the hops. Who can throw the most hops into an IPA? How much can we shove in there, with sort of forgetting that people drink this? Like it just seems to be sort of like a competition with hops, forgetting like at the end of this, you don't just want to taste like bitterness. Like, have you considered the finish? How is the malt interplaying with this? What about hop flavor? Like, not just bitterness. It felt to me for a while there, when all these like hop bombs were coming up, people were forgetting that there's all these other components that we need to be thinking about.
Oh, absolutely.
We've completely forgotten about them.
Especially that sort of like early 2000s, like where there was the sort of IBU arms race where like, I just want it to be as bitter as it can possibly be. And every now and then one of those would work and you'd be like, wow, this is really interesting. But it would all be so unbalanced and so extreme, but people thought extreme was good because of reasons that we'll get into another time, probably. But, it's interesting that, you would get things that were either really, 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 bitter, or would sort of get that really green hop flavor, which sometimes is great, but in extreme, like, you're like, it's like drinking grass clippings. Like, no. And then on the flip side, either too sweet too, like, especially so you get some of the really strong double and triple IPAs, so hard to pull off effectively, because there are some great ones. But I'm going to read a quote from Garrett Oliver, and this is out of the Oxford Companion to Beer, which again only published 2012, so we're not going that long ago. But he's talking a little bit just about, this is in the double IPA entry, and he says, as of 2011, more than 100 double IPAs were being produced by American craft brewers. I mean, just think of that as a number. And these beers are now beginning to have an influence in Europe and beyond. The style moniker double IPA, which he puts in like very judgy air quotes, and I'm here for it, it's okay, rankles with traditionalists who feel it confuses both brewing history and modern consumers. In its heyday, IPA was a well-defined style. I think we'll think about that. And double IPA is a distinctly different beer. Perhaps it ought somehow to be named for its native California. The nomenclature has surely left the barn, however, and triple and quadruple IPA cannot be far behind. And again, this is 2012, so
can't be asked. You know what? It's no wonder the New England and the East Coast IPAs took over and have been like reigning supreme of late, because like, as you say, Lisa, like it was one of those like competitions where everybody was like, how bitter can it get? How hoppy can it get? It was like just adding more and more and more and more stuff in. And to the point that actually what was the biggest loss was that hops are actually really expensive, and you want to use them wisely, and you want to be able to taste them. You don't just want to taste blanket bitterness or blanket anything. But what was happening was that people were adding so much crap in there that they all started tasting exactly the same.
Yes.
Like that's it.
Yep.
Exactly the same.
Yep. And I will agree with you. Unpopular opinion, a lot of those IPAs tasted exactly the same.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
But it's
you
also,
put them up.
Yeah.
I mean, we're BJCP judges or, learning BJCP. And you wouldn't really be able to make that much of a difference between
You wouldn't.
No, when we first moved to Seattle, which would have been in 2015 or 16, we were surprised because moving from the East Coast to Seattle, we're like, oh great, we're gonna go all these cool Pacific Northwest IPAs and other stuff. But then we didn't realize that we wouldn't get anything else because you would go to a tap room, they would have 20 taps, 19 of them would be an identical strong IPA.
Yeah.
It was double or triple-ish, and there'd be nothing else. And you'd be like, really, guys, like, come on,
Yeah, like when bitterness is the end game, and that's really what you're working with, and you're probably using a similar hop profile, like similar, I said Centennial, those. It's gonna take. There's only so much if you're not paying attention to other things as part of the brew. Like, there's only so much you can do if you're not really considering other things, other parts. Which I think was probably behind, like you're saying, the New England IPA, but also like the interest in Belgian IPAs and black IPAs.
Absolutely,
something different. Like
something different.
Something else here.
And I'm at the I was just gonna go back a little further in time, not far again. Sort of, this is again early 2000s, and in Michael Jackson's Ultimate Beer, which he autographed this for us because he was lovely and we miss him. He was a wonderful man, but he has IPAs as aperitifs. I mean, that suggests nuance, suggests that there's potentially some delicate flavors in that kind of thing. But he's talking about. IPAs were stronger so they could continue fermenting, which again, maybe not. But he does talk about how, it's really about how they're dry. They, they can sort of go with all these different kinds of food, which I completely agree with. But he's only got, I think, like 10 or something in here, and a lot of these are not made anymore. And these were very much kind of in that, what we might call sort of historic IPA style, but historic for sort of what was still a British IPA in maybe the 60s or 70s to a certain extent, so certainly not something that would have, gone on any kind of holiday, if you like. But it's fascinating how different they are, how you would have had that sort of citrusy, or, he describes a lot of them as having that sort of, that oily hoppiness to them, instead of just being hit over the head with that bitterness. And you think about how, from sort of a craft beer perspective, how Stone, that was their calling card back in the day, where they're like, you're not extreme enough to like our IPA, which in retrospect is like a 6.5% IPA. That's just fine. Yeah, but
now it is. But I mean, at the time,
exactly at the time,
it was just one of those things.
Big deal.
It was a big deal, and it was annoying because if you didn't like IPAs at the time, you weren't cool. Like you were just not seen.
And it was very blokey, and it was very, it absolutely. And again, you have sort of lacking that balance, and then again in Garrett Oliver in Oxford Companion to Beer really does name check like Russian River with Pliny the Elder, and like even though that's a double IPA, it is gorgeous. It's beautifully balanced, has this great malt backbone. It's you're not you don't feel like you're drinking something that's 8.5-9%. It's just it's wonderfully done. And again, there are some great fresh hop beers, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where again they get the balance right. And I think actually fresh hop beers are just one of the most wonderful things if you live somewhere where you can get them. I mean, and it's got to be seasonal. It's got to have all of that, because if it's not quite right, it's not right. And like you were saying before, Thandi, like I love a black IPA, but when it's the wrong hops and the wrong roast, you get that sort of ashy flavor, and
or you get something that's very tanniny or something, and it's just, and then it's not good. But I mean, look, sure, like you could say that about any type of beer, like as soon as you kind of do it wrong, it doesn't work. But I feel like a lot of people have gotten away with mediocre IPAs for years, just because you could kind of add a whole bunch of hops. You could mask exactly. You could mask a lot with your IPAs. And instead of it being the style that was like ridiculed for being everything but the kitchen sink style. It was one of those that was lauded as being the ultimate craft beer,
I agree. I think it was also kind of like cool points. Like, oh, I can drink this like super bitter hot bomb. I'm super cool. And it's like, I mean, like that's how it was when I started really getting into craft beer.
Definitely.
It was like, you wanted to drink the hoppiest, most intense beer. And, you don't like this beer. Why don't you like this beer? Like, this is a good beer. Like, what is wrong with it? And it's just like, well, it's just like really bitter. But like, I mean, I was on that train. I was drinking the IPAs. I'm making fun of myself.
Me too. Me too.
I was definitely like, give me the hoppiest, most ridiculous IPAs. I was here for it, but I think I just kind of burned out on it after a while.
Same.
But when I first got into it, I was really there for those really strong IPAs.
Yeah. I remember getting oh gosh, which one's the End of History? Because I was like, these are always a bad decision when you get them. It's always like toward the end of the day, you've probably had a few too many, but you're like, I will have the beer that costs $30 for, whatever. Why not? And, I'm glad I tried it, but at the same time, like, did I enjoy it? I don't know that it's the same experience. It's a very different beast, but again, you don't want to fall into the trap of just like, I take that box and that box and that box. But it's a funny thing because when I look back again to that sort of late 90s, early 2000s when it was all about kind of hops, bitter, like, it was all about, how many Pliny the Elders have you had once? And you're like, I don't need like 2 pints of it. It is, glorious to have a little, little thing of it. You're all good. But
equally, people have got that way with the New England IPAs, right?
Yeah.
With Heady Topper and those sorts of things. And I have to admit that I'm somewhat guilty of this because my parents were in Vermont and very kindly, they waited outside of the Alchemist and got me Heady Topper and Focal Banger. And when I went home to visit them, I was able to, of course, drink them, which was just amazing. Thank you, parents, for the best birthday present. So I'm also guilty of that.
Oh, sure.
We all are, though. We're all caught up in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And in fact,
they were right next to it. So they were just like, they're like, listen, like the line's not that long. We'll go wait for you. This will be your birthday present. I was like,
oh, see, that's beautiful. Yeah, it's funny because I dashed off in like 10 minutes the most sort of half-assed thing ever about comparing Pliny the Elder and younger because I went to try both at a charity tasting. Charity, I was doing good. And it's like literally the worst thing I've ever written. It is the most popular thing I've ever written just because those two beers are in it and it gets searched for again and again. I feel like every now and then I'm like, God, I should write something that's like, look, I wrote this in like 5 minutes as a sort of, thought experiment. It was not meant to be like the definitive, tasting guide to either of these beers, but it's, I feel like in some ways it's become that. And I feel like those beers in particular too represent a sort of very particular moment in time, and the industry has moved on in a lot of other ways, but they're still kind of held up, which is sort of good and bad. It's a, I don't know if it's bad as exactly, but it's strange that you do get these sort of, I don't know, monoliths almost.
Yeah,
you do, yes.
But I think that there's something psychological about experiencing a beer that has sort of these connections within the craft beer community that you kind of feel like you're not just drinking a beer, but perhaps you're partaking of part of this community, like you're having shared experience.
Definitely.
Like that's kind of how I felt. Like, okay, like I'm in Ireland, so a lot of times when I listen to podcasts or hear about, I listen to a lot of non-Irish things, and so they're things in America, and it's like, wow, I can actually have this really famous American beer that other people have had, and you kind of feel like maybe I can connect a bit to that community now. Kind of tap into that thing. And yeah, I mean, like there has to be like I'm sure that there is like some psychological component of enjoying the beer simply because it's the beer, and that makes it better to you than maybe it actually is, but because it has all this aspect of community or where you're sitting or who you're with or what you're doing or your mood for the day, that automatically makes it better. Because I know that I have beers that are probably average at best, but I love them because the first time I drank it was an amazing experience or something like that. So it's always going to be close to my heart, regardless of whether it's the best beer in the world.
Absolutely. And although
Mm.
on the flip side of that too, and this is going to be terrible for people who've never been able to drink it, but during one Philly beer week, and again, exactly the same reasons, I was out with my crew, basically doing the all women beer club I was in was doing a train based beer crawl, which oh my god, so much fun.
Oh my
Just
God, that sounds
highly
exactly
recommend.
like a
that.
thing that I would do.
Mhm.
Oh my
The
God.
first or second stop was a bar that was serving Pliny the Elder, which again you can get in Philly or you can get in California. I don't know why sometimes it's easier to get in Philly than in California, but reasons. And they were serving it in like big chilled pints, like the worst way to drink this beer, and so you got to be like judging at the same time and be like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this. This is not the right way to do this at all. But also being like, all right, so, going for it. And then by the time you get to the third place, you're like, oh, maybe we can just slow down for a while and not have
You know
to.
what?
But
You're
there you
raising
go.
something. You're raising something that I think is really interesting, and I think it's particularly an IPA thing as well. Is that we have all been accused of being beer snobs. Okay,
Sure.
we've all had it, and I'm telling you, it's an IPA thing because there was. IPAs are just one of those beers that you can get super snobby about. You can be like, oh, your glass isn't right. Oh, it's not the right temperature.
Yeah.
Oh, you should warm it up. Oh, you should cool it down. You like if there was ever a beer to give us a bad name, actually, it was the bloody IPA. As much as we all love them and as much as they're iconic and as much as they're not even cult classics, they're just classics. Like it's one of those things that brought out a whole lot into society, and that like hipster notion of like hipsters loving craft beer and being far too good for you in their rags, that comes from IPA straight up.
Yeah, I agree. And did you guys like when you started getting into craft beer? Like I got the, sometimes from some like hipster dudes, like the pop quiz, like, oh, do you like beer? Do you really like beer?
Yeah.
What's an IPA? Oh, and that myth that we talked about, that was one of the things. Well, where does an IPA come from? And why is it actually called? And it's like, now I'm like, well, it's actually a myth. So all that stuff that you said is not true.
So,
Yeah.
Not true.
Yeah.
You're not done, but definitely got that pop quiz when I was like first started drinking beer.
Same.
Which was just really frustrating, but it was definitely like, I think I started like peak snob, like where people were really like, oh, are you really like craft beer? Like, because as if women couldn't like craft beer unless they were trying to impress men.
And even I feel like even before that, there was a thing of like, oh, well, unless you like dark beer, you don't really, unless you like Belgian beer, you don't really. But I feel like IPAs have held sway for such a long time. And again, I think there is something in you can append IPA to anything.
You really can.
And again, like a session IPA, it's a pale ale. Let's just,
Can we please talk about that? Because they're freaking the same thing, and I don't ever know why people get away with calling them different
one sells and
things.
one doesn't. And this is something I've had this argument with brewers who are like, look, we know, but this is what sells. And I totally get it. You're just putting on the label that sells. Which again, then, put your mind back 150 years. Was that true then too?
Exactly.
We don't know.
Exactly. Like humans are very bizarre creatures who do things for strange reasons because we like what we like and we are completely irrational. Like we're just totally
but we also follow
creatures.
cults. We follow cults. Like we'll follow because you know what, when it was all West Coast IPAs and it was like super bitter, like let's get off the IBU chart, all of those things. That was one thing. Now it's the East Coast, and it's still the East Coast IPAs. Guys, there's been East Coast IPAs for a very long time now. I'm a little sick of them, to be honest. But here in Ireland, anyway, I still see sometimes like these double IPAs, and then like instead of just calling it an IPA, people will talk about how many times it was dry hopped. So now it's a double dry hopped IPA. As if I fucking care. Just give me a good beer. Like I don't care how many times it was dry hopped. Actually, give me the beer. Let me make up my own mind. But if I see another a double dry hopped IPA, as if it's its own style, I actually might blow up. I don't know.
Now, what I do think is interesting though is at least now so many tell you like which hops they're using. That is fantastic. I love that, especially because there are a couple I don't love. So it's great to be able to like.
Same.
Have a look.
Oh, dude, me too.
And that's where you can get a lot of difference is if you change the hops. Like
absolutely.
And you go from, floral to earthy to spicy to, New World tropical. And that's where you can get like a lot more interesting beer. That said, I'm still very much on the New England IPA train. But that is because I don't drink a lot of them. So I specifically seek out lagers and other types of beer. So when I'm having an IPA, it's good because I don't want to get sick of it, because I got sick of the West Coast style, and I don't want to get sick of the New England ones, because I'm really here for the restrained bitterness and the tropical and juicy flavors, especially on a really nice sunny day. I think they're gorgeous. Like, I think they're just, no, not today so much, but maybe this morning. I'll give it a couple hours, it'll be sunny again. But yeah, like I'm really interested in that, but I drink them, limitedly, because I don't want to ruin them for myself.
And I think it is tricky too, because there are a couple of people who just always knock it out of the park. Like Whiplash is always good, even when I don't like other ones. I know that's going to be good because they just nail it. But then, like you said, if you try others where you're like, you can get really cynical about the style, because you're like, and I definitely had that before we moved here, because everything had become that, and a lot of them weren't great, and so you have to kind of, there were still some that were really good, and those were really good, but when you have the others that are kind of mediocre, but again, I think it's true of any beer style, not just IPA. It's just so pronounced, I think, with some of the New England ones, that because if it's not good, it's not good. And again, like with an IPA, you can hide a lot compared to like a lager, but only so much. So you still have to know what you're doing.
Here's another unpopular opinion. I, to this day, cannot tell the difference between a lot of the Whiplash beers, because there are so many IPAs that I can't keep track. It's probably my own failing, but like there are so many that I'm like, God. I look at the ingredients in the can. I'm like, what changed? What changed?
The new West Coast one is really good. Look for that.
I do want to try that, because it is a little different from what they've been doing. They've been doing a lot of like East Coast, and like everything's got oats, everything's got Yukonot, which I hate Yukonot. Sometimes it works, but like it's just one of those things. It tastes like green pepper to me. It's gross.
Interesting. Ooh, see, that's interesting too. There's a whole other like genetics of taste in there too that is fun to unpick.
It's a weird one.
And see, I like Whiplash because they add the oats and the wheat, and I think it's really interesting to see how creative they get with the malt profile, because that's really interesting, and it makes something different in terms of an IPA. So I'm with Lisa. Like if I'm drinking an IPA, I know that if I get one from Whiplash, it's going to be good.
Especially like the Northern Lights, the micro IPA, that is so hard to do well.
No,
oh my God, but that is just amazing.
That's a great one.
I'm enjoying this one from Metalman, to be honest with you.
Lovely.
It's really like tropical and fruity, which I really, really like. And it has that fuller and creamier flavor, but it's not too creamy or too full. So it's definitely still like very much approachable. And it's 5.8%, which isn't too high of an ABV, because sometimes people with IPVs are really, or IPAs, the ABV is very hard.
True.
Which I don't also like. I like the lower ABVs because I don't just drink one beer. So
I really like to like brews. Just standard IPA is like, I want to say like 5%, like maybe 4.8. Oh my gosh, perfect for like being outside in the sun on the rare occasions when we get that. But it's, I feel like it is a perfect beer for that, and it's got all the right, it hits all the right notes in the profile. You get the hoppiness, but you get the malt, sort of biscuity backbone. And again, you can get some that are a little unbalanced, so it's nice to have something you can just grab and like you say, have more than one of, because I would say, especially in the States, and I don't know, Thandi, if you found this in South Africa as much, but they do tend to be, or at least the popular IPAs, whether they're New England or whatever, do tend to be 7%, 8%, and I can only do so many of them. I'm only small. So.
I've seen them with 12, 10, 12%. Like,
crazy. It's crazy.
This. Like,
one of them for dessert, sure, but like of an afternoon, come on,
Yeah, especially at beer festivals. I'm like, how am I going to drink a 12% beer at a beer? You'd have to have like the tiniest amount.
Just like a taster. But then it means that you're never going to buy the beer. So for me, it's not a good strategy to take like big old beers, unless that's the only way you're going to sell them, is like as tasters, and then you're charging for tasters. So, people do it differently. I think in a lot of ways, there was, before I left South Africa, there were a lot of like big IPAs, and it was one of those things, but it had already moved a little bit towards other styles and towards other things. I came here, and I was smack bang in the middle of like IPA fever, and I thought, okay, cool. And the thing is, I love IPAs. Truly, I
Right.
really do. And it took me a little while to actually like them because I guess maybe I didn't like the bitterness, or maybe I didn't understand the fruitiness, or maybe it didn't quite cotton on straight away. But once I did, I was full on IPA snob, loved all of them. And give me all of the big ones, like I was right there. But Christina, kind of like you, I got so sick of them. Like I just drank so many that they started tasting the same and all of that. But I think a lot of people are screaming now around the world for different styles, sessionable beers. People are loving alcohol-free or low alcohol. So like your micro IPAs, people are loving other styles. Thank God, lagers. Thank God for that.
Yes.
Lagers
Oh
are
my
back.
I do somewhat fear though that we'll be here in 5 years going, I'm so sick of lagers.
Maybe. You're probably right.
They're all tasting the same.
They're all the same.
God, you're probably right. Oh, how terrible. So maybe it's just one of those things, right? They go in and out of fashion. and whatever the flavor of the month is or flavor of the year is, that's what reigns. And I don't know, that's what happens. But like right now when I'm making decisions on what to buy, like I don't go for double dry hopped IPAs at 13%. And it's not because they're probably not good, it's just because I don't feel like that. I feel like that new rice lager from Rascals, because I haven't had that yet. I'm very curious, and I love a rice lager, so that's what I want. Or I want a good vit from Whitbread.
Yeah, summery, cocktaily. There's a time and place. It's all good.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been looking at my.
I'm the same. When I'm reaching for beer, it's lower ABV, and then like lagers or pale ales or something just easy to drink, but interesting.
Yes.
Absolutely. And then again, there are some really good, like, again, even though let's be real, they are pale ales, but there are some great session IPAs. Again, like Four Provinces. Oh my gosh, it's really good, but it gets all, it ticks all the right boxes for an IPA that's just a little lower key, and it's again, it's pale ale, but it's beautiful, and I love to be able to have a can of that. I know, like, they're open again, you can go and get takeaway pints, which sounds amazing, but again, like, thinking about, like, your Cascadian dark ales, so many of them tend to be 7-8%, but there's a real sort of happy place around sort of 5-6 that I would love to see more in that space, and just more of them available too. Again, I don't care what we call them. I understand why some purists get very fussy about it. I've been that person. Again, I've been 100% the person who's like, but that's not accurate. We can't do that. But also, I've gotten over it. I've worked through it. Let's call it whatever. I'm happy to have a dark IPA. And again, there was even like a big historical sort of kerfuffle early sort of 2000s of were IPAs darker in color. Again, we don't have fantastic evidence either way, but there was a sort of probably for a while, just based on what you could see of the grain bills and so on, of some historical ones. But again, it's what we have evidence of. It's not in any way the full picture. So, and I think this is I'll sort of lament this on like Irish beer Twitter too. We have so few records of what we should have. Obviously, there's the Diageo have all the Guinness stuff, but what about everyone else? Like, where are all of those brewing records? They're either in someone's attic somewhere or they're gone. And it would just be great to compare, contrast, and know what people were actually making. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, obviously, like the issue with written records is just because someone wrote something down doesn't mean that's the way it was happening.
Yeah.
So, we have to, use them with archaeology if we have it. And if we have those. And so we have to be really careful when we're using written records, depending on how far you're going back. But like, if it's not within living memory, because people can write things that just aren't true, or write what they wished something was, and not necessarily what reality is. Like, it can be prescriptive. Like, in my ideal of reality, this is what we should be doing, but it might not have been what was actually happening.
Exactly.
Or it just may not have been common. Like, it could be what they were doing, but not what everyone is doing, and fair enough, right?
Or they did it one time, and then they said, this is what we're doing all of the time.
Yeah, and again, was it written down because it wasn't happening? I mean, I think that's, when you look at certainly legal history, people wrote things down because people were doing things, not because they weren't doing things. So it's,
exactly.
What was the reverse?
It could be a wish list. Like, come on, we need to be doing this. You aren't doing this. How many times do I need to tell you? I'm going to write it down for you so you can read it. So we can do this. Please do this. And then they're still like, nah.
Exactly. And and you're the, like, that's assuming too everyone was doing, the right things. I think, certainly we know people are always like, okay, but can I get this cheaper? Can I, people are looking to make a profit. They're not necessarily looking to have
Exactly.
the best product, especially if the people you're shipping it to get it 4 months later and can't complain. Do you care? No, you
Exactly.
sold it. Yeah.
So it's perfectly possible that they were writing this down, saying that they were doing this, and then cutting the corners and cutting the costs and just not doing it to save a buck. I mean, it's equally possible that they were listening to it, but like we have evidence from medieval period of people cheating their customers. So, humans are going to human, and that means they're probably going to cheat, and they're probably, so,
Cheaper is good.
Exactly.
All right, friends, I think it's just about time for us to wrap up. Are there any final thoughts now on IPAs, whether it's culture, your favorite style, anything that you'd like to add? Christina, I'll go to you.
Well, I'm from the East Coast, so East Coast IPAs all the way. No, I'm kidding. But I do really like East Coast IPAs. I think this one from Metalman is really, really nice. I've had lots of really good ones. I think Rascals had a really nice one. I've drank quite a few really good ones actually in Ireland. Some that I've preferred to American versions when I've gone home and tried. So I will say that the Irish craft beer community has done a really good job on New England IPAs. I actually don't think I've had one here that I haven't liked. Full stop. So yeah, I think they've done a really good job with that. But then again, like I said, I drink them sparingly so I don't get sick of them because I do like them.
Fair enough. Lisa, any parting thoughts from you, friend?
Yeah, I think again that I always go back to, the different kinds of hops, and knowing that what we had historically is nothing like what we had today, even just in the last 20 years. Like, just hop breeding is such a different science that there's no way we can really compare the flavors. But that said, I do love the other East Coast IPAs, the ones that are sort of, which I'm putting in air quotes, traditional English ones that are maybe a little lower key, sort of 5-6%, as opposed to being sort of 7-8. I think of like Yards has a wonderful IPA. They're a strong one. They're Cape of Good Hope IPA, which again, bringing in the whole mythology of sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, all of that. But it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous beer. But I do love a lot of my West Coast IPAs. In fact, one of my favorite things lately has been the Thornbridge collaboration with Firestone Walker. It's called Pondera. It is a gorgeous, just, I'll say 1990 style West Coast IPA. Really, really good. But again, to Christina's point, there are Irish breweries here doing an amazing, amazing job. I think of, I love like Hope's IPA, the Handsome Jack, is just so good as a go-to. All the Whiplash stuff, again, their new West Coast IPA is great. And obviously their New England ones are great. But I think there are just a lot that are really, really good. The Ballykilcavan Millhouse one, which is kind of their session IPA, just
that's lovely.
Beautiful beer, and nice to get them when we can get them like nice and fresh. And we're not going to see amazing fresh hop beers just because we're not growing enough hops here to get that sort of fresh hop thing every sort of August, September. But it'd be interesting if we did start to get that, just for those people who are growing their own hops. Plant that seed, your canvases, and people who are trying to do that. So maybe in a year or two. Let's check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. You just reminded me of of a beer from CBC who I mentioned in the last episode. Back in South Africa, they had a beer called the Cape of Good Hops. And it was an imperial IPA actually. It was a really, really good West Coast, seriously bitter, like really, really bitter, and the label was phenomenal. So I don't know if they still make it or indeed what's going on with it, but that was a lovely beer. My goodness. So anyway, parting thoughts. I'm probably a little bit seasonal with these kinds of things as well. Sometimes I really love New England IPAs or East Coast because they're soft and they're easy and they're lovely and they're just delicious. And then I have the days like today where I'm like, fuck those guys. I want a West Coast. I want bitterness. Like I want strength and I want all of the things. But, I think it's cool that there's a lot of different kinds of IPAs out there. And I think it's one of those styles that you can find a favorite. Like you can. Yeah. It almost, we always talk about the fact that people can find their favorite kind of or style of beer. But I think even within an IPA family, you could find your favorite. IPAs are super versatile and you can tack on that IPA to almost any style and make it fun. And it's just one of those things. I think IPAs are iconic, and it's nice to celebrate them sometimes, even if we disagree as to which ones are the best. All right. Fam, friends, everybody in between, thank you for listening to the Beer Ladies podcast. This was our episode 30 on IPAs. It was another addition to our style guide, which we're slowly growing. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Let us know what your favorite IPAs are, whether in Ireland or around the world. Let us know your favorites. Let us know what you like and dislike in an IPA. Are you firmly East Coast, firmly West Coast, or firmly somewhere elsewhere? Tell us all the things. And go ahead, follow us there on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube, please, please, please. And we will see you next week with another Beer Ladies podcast episode. Thank you, friends. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.